Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Sadowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Circulate Initiative, and I'm so happy to invite you and have you on this webinar around financing considerations to support the international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. This is the second of 4 webinars that the Financing Coordination Group will host on financing considerations. On this call, we will talk about financial mechanisms, supported obligations, and addressing potential funding gaps. So thank you so much for joining. In terms of our agenda today, we will have a few individuals share opening remarks to frame the conversation. We'll have a recap of the first webinar that the Financing Coordination Group held. We'll have a presentation and panel discussion on different financing mechanisms. We will have time for Q&A. And then we'll close it in about 75 minutes with brief remarks. So that's our agenda today. In terms of housekeeping, everyone is muted on the webinar. We very much encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature. So on the bottom in the middle, we will try to answer those live, or we will hold them towards the end. We are recording this webinar, and we will share the recording as well as a summary report. And you have Umesh's email in the screen that you can email him for additional questions. So those are the housekeeping logistics. And just very briefly, so I've just got a few minutes just to set the scene. So as I mentioned, I work for the Circulate Initiative, which is a nonprofit working to eliminate ocean plastic pollution and build circular and equitable economies across emerging markets. I think we all know on this call the challenge that we face, that we're trying to deliver a robust plastics treaty by the end of 2024. We know that mobilizing financial resources at scale is essential for the implementation of the treaty. We had a webinar back in March, I think, and we described how several like-minded organizations, including United Nations Environment Program, Finance Initiative, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the Circulate Initiative, and others have joined forces to form the so-called Financing Coordination Group. The goals of this group are to really improve the overall understanding of the financing landscape for tackling plastic pollution and to ultimately catalyze additional capital to address plastic pollution. So this is our second webinar. We'll have 2 more leading up to INC 5 in November. And really the goal of this webinar is to improve our collective understanding of 2 topics. 1, the financial resources that can be mobilized for the implementation of the treaty, and then 2, the alignment of financial flows. I'm really thrilled that we have such a fantastic lineup of speakers and subject matter experts, and I will be the moderator in the background. So again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, in the Q&A feature, and we really look forward to your engagement. And so with that, I'm really thrilled to invite Oliver Bocci, our first speaker. So Oliver is Special Advisor to the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology, and Innovation in Ghana. Oliver is also the co-chair of the Intersessional Open-Ended Expert Group 1 on Finance. So Oliver, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues and friends. Welcome to the second webinar of the Financing Coordination Group webinar series. As we head towards Busan for the 5th and final meeting of the INC, the need to focus on a suitable financial mechanism and how to mobilize resources to implement the international legally binding instrument cannot be overemphasized. We all recognize the importance of the plastics industry and the value that plastics provides both to business and in our lives as individuals. At the same time, we also recognize the enormous challenges that we face with the production and consumption of plastics and how these challenges occur throughout the life cycle of plastics. The international legally binding instrument provides a unique opportunity to reform the industry, protect the environment and its biodiversity, and to address the challenges of climate change and safeguard the health of our citizens against plastics pollution. Reforming the industry will come at very significant cost, and the instrument must provide support for industry to make this possible. Protecting the environment and its biodiversity requires that we prevent the leakage of plastics into both the terrestrial and marine environments. The instrument must provide support to member states and local governments to make this possible. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the production and consumption of plastics demand that we reuse, recycle, and treat end-of-life plastics in environmentally sound ways, including the treatment of legacy plastics. Again, the instrument must provide support to make this possible. Recent studies have shown that in order for the instrument to achieve its goal of ending plastic pollution, financial resources in excess of trillions of US dollars will be required over a 15-year period. If we just focus on the resources needed by developing countries alone, annual budgets in excess of $22 billion will be required for each of the 15 years. These are resources that traditional sources of funding alone would not be able to provide. It is for this reason that UNIA Resolution 514 enjoins us to be ambitious and innovative in our approaches, consider the full life cycle of plastics, and aim at creating a true circular economy within the plastics value chains. We are also enjoined by the resolution to look at all sources, including the private sector. This second webinar is creating a platform for us to deliberate on the financial mechanism that is needed by the instrument and the potential sources from which those resources will be mobilized. It also allows us to examine how the mechanism aligns the use of the resources with the obligations of the instrument, bearing in mind the importance of sustainability, accessibility, transparency, and accountability in the utilization of the resources. I want to entreat all those who have managed to join us today to use this webinar to inform ourselves as we prepare to participate in the intersessional work activities in Bangkok, and to get prepared for candid and fruitful negotiations when we go to Busan in November. With regards to the intersessional work that is currently underway, we, the co-chairs, are working very closely with the chair of the INC and the Secretariat to develop a program of work that will enable us enable members of the committee to share knowledge and establish the scientific and factual basis for negotiations at INC 5. For Expert Group 1, we are planning to have not less than 10 knowledge sharing sessions where all the elements within the mandate will be discussed. There will be at least 2 sessions every day, with the possibility of additional sessions in the evening on some days. As you all know, these sessions are not negotiation sessions, but rather sessions at which experts from member states will have the opportunity to discuss and share knowledge among themselves and with internationally recognized experts on the relevant elements. The co-chairs will be the facilitators of the discussions, and when necessary, they may call on known experts to share their knowledge and experiences with us. In the 3 virtual meetings ahead of the in-person meeting, we are seeking input from member states experts as we develop the program of work for the meeting in Bangkok. Those of us who managed to join the first online meeting would agree that we are well on our way towards that. In the second virtual meeting, we will start looking at the substantive elements of the mandate and set the stage for actual discussions to take place in Bangkok. We will be looking at seeking common understanding of keywords such as aligning, catalyzing, financial flows, and options for financial mechanisms, etc. I'd like to take this opportunity to entreat all of you to join us for the second virtual meeting on the 1st of August, 2024. And on that note, I wish you all fruitful deliberations in the course of this second webinar. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Oliver, thank you so much. That was a perfect setup. Peter, I'm going to invite you to join us to give a recap of the webinar. So Peter Borky is the Circular Economy Lead at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So Peter, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction, and very glad really that I get this opportunity to make an attempt to summarize and recap the very rich discussion that we had during the first webinar that this group organized back in April. So that first webinar was really essentially aiming to provide an initial overview of some key challenges and good practices and set the scene for subsequent more focused webinars on this important topic. So I'll try to be very short. 5 minutes is not a long time. So some of the key takeaways really included a number of points around the scope of the treaty and the rationale for a financing mechanism. So speakers and panelists pointed out that there is a link between the means of implementation and the control measures that will be agreed under the treaty, and that only a robust, legally binding instrument with globally harmonized rules that cover the full life cycle of plastics would allow to minimize implementation costs. Policies that reduce the flow, in particular, the flow of primary plastics into the economy, are the most effective way to minimize the complexity and the cost of the elimination of plastic pollution. In order to cover these costs, all sources, and Oliver Bochi just made this point before, all sources of finance will need to be mobilized, including international public finance, domestic public finance, and private capital. And I think a number of us said in the webinar that international development finance alone is unlikely to be able to cover all financing needs. It's also clear that developing countries will need specific support, as the financial burden that they will have to bear is larger in proportion than in developed countries, and their capacity, of course, to leverage finance is more limited. We then, I think, went on to discuss some of the basic functions that a financing mechanism would need to fulfill. A financing mechanism, whether newly established or built within an existing financial arrangement, would need to provide different types of financial support for enabling activities for implementation, such as institutional strengthening and reporting obligations, clearinghouse functions such as education and technology transfer, incremental costs related to treaty compliance, as well as other costs linked to unlocking financial support, and in this context, innovative approaches towards international financial institutions and multilateral development banks could help to unlock private sector finance at scale. The webinar then provided some insights from existing financing mechanisms and good practices. And we first heard from the Global Environment Facility, which indicated that it could support the implementation of the new instrument via the integration of the agreement into the existing GEF trust fund, or via the creation of a multi-trust fund program. GEF can also establish mechanisms to facilitate financing from various sources, including the private sector. We then heard from the Multilateral Fund for the Implementation of the Montreal Protocol. This suggested that its success, and I think it's broadly viewed as a success, is due to, first of all, its predictable funding, strong governance, incremental cost approach, and a strong capacity development component. We then heard about outcomes-based financing from the World Bank and its recent plastic waste reduction-linked bond, which offers a financial return based on verified reductions in plastic waste and carbon emissions in projects in Ghana and Indonesia. And finally, we heard from a commercial bank that commercial finance can be unlocked if the treaty has ambitious, clear, and measurable objectives, which allows banks to use common financial instruments such as sustainability-linked loans to finance plastic pollution solutions. So these were some of the key takeaways. Of course, the discussion was much richer than this, but I've tried really to boil it down very much. And so now we're trying to delve into more detail into some of these issues. And this is, I think, what we'll do next. So thank you.
Excellent. Peter, right on time. So really appreciate that. And thank you for the recap. I'm going to now pass it over to Tao Wang, Senior Environmental Finance Specialist at the World Bank, and he'll share a presentation on the different financial mechanisms. So Tao, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will spend the next 10 minutes or so to talk about three things. One, what is a financial mechanism and the common structure and features of a financial mechanism. Two, the different options for establishing such a financial mechanism and the pros and cons for each of the options, and what new dedicated fund, existing fund, and hybrid approach means. And then finally, I will talk about some of the factors for your consideration and for discussion. So with this introduction, if I may ask to put up the presentation slide. With this introduction that I just mentioned, let's move into the content of the presentation. So this is a slide showing the main features of a multilateral fund. When it comes to establishing a financial mechanism with independent governance and multiple implementing partners, the financial mechanism often refers to such a multilateral fund with the following features. One, it's large and multi-partner funds used by international communities to pool funding from multiple sources and aiming to tackle development challenges. And these funds have independent governance structures. Although they are often facilitated by a hosting institution, the hosting institution doesn't play a role in decision-making. It's the governance body of the fund that makes the decision. Another feature of the multilateral funds is that they rely on a group of institutions to implement activities as implementing entities or implementing agencies. Those implementing agencies or entities have the capacity, experience, and are accountable to the governing body of the fund for the use of the financial resources and comply with relevant policies and procedures. So many of these funds are set up through the World Bank as financial intermediary funds, FIFs. With that, I wanted to move to the next slide to show you the structure, a typical structure of such a financial intermediary fund. There are mainly four entities or four roles in this structure. First, on the top, you can see it's the governing body who provides strategic direction and oversight and makes decisions on policies, funding, allocations, and so on and so forth. And then second, the trustee role. It's essentially a fund custodian who receives and manages funds while the fund is held in trust. The trustee transfer funds based on governing body's instruction and sign agreements when the governing body doesn't have a legal capacity to do so. And then the third entity is the implementing entity I just mentioned, who implements projects and programs in accordance with the policy and procedures of the fund. Last but not least, very actually important, is the secretariat, who supports the governing body, who performs the day-to-day activities of the fund, review project proposals, prepares work plan and budget, and report progress and results to the governing body. Again, there's no decision-making authority on funding allocations by the secretariat. It's acting really under the guidance of the governing body. So knowing the features and structure of a financial mechanism, in this context, a financial intermediary fund, let's move to the next slide and talk about the possible options for establishing such a financial mechanism. So you can see on the screen, there are three options. Option 1 is to create a new fund that has legal capacity, but the secretariat is not hosted by the World Bank. This option essentially means that, you know, a new institution may be established under the laws of a host country. And then, for example, the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, is established with a host country in the Republic of Korea. Option 2 is integrating the fund into an existing fund. So it may mean create a new window or broaden the mandate of an existing window or adding a new fund in an existing family of funds. So a typical example would be the recently established Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. It's established as a fund integrated into the Global Environment Facility. And option 3 essentially is creating a new fund or financial intermediary fund, FIF, and to be hosted by the World Bank. Let's move to the animation. As you can see, you know, we often hear the new dedicated funds. So mapping that to these 3 options, option 1 and 3 essentially are the category that we need to establish a new dedicated fund. Whereas the option 2, if we can move to the next animation action, is existing fund. So option 1 and 3 means that new dedicated funds, and option 2 is essentially creating a fund integrated into the existing fund. But then you may ask, what does the hybrid approach mean? So let's move to the next slide. As you can see from this slide, 1 and 3 under new dedicated fund, option 2 under existing fund, and then hybrid just means that we take option 1 as an interim arrangement for an interim period of time, and then after the interim period of time, the governing body of the fund may decide to remain as is or transition to a new fund under option 1. So a typical example will be the fund for responding to loss and damage that was decided to be established by the last climate change COP. Now, here I wanted to show you the pros and cons of these 3 options. Option 1, establishing a new fund, will give us flexibility, maximum flexibility in terms of the fund's policy, rules, procedures, including how to access to and use the funds, because we are essentially establishing a new institution, an entirely new fund. But then the challenges we will be facing is set up such a fund can be time-consuming, costly, and labor-intensive. Also, it would add to the fragmentation of existing financing architecture. Option 2 would have the benefit of faster establishment compared to option 1. And then it would allow us to leverage the existing fund structure, policy, procedure, and system. So it will be more cost-effective. But of course, the drawback will be less flexible compared to option 1 and 3. And it could be complex structure if, you know, we looking at integrating it into the existing fund. And also the establishment, design, operation are subject to the hosting fund's governing body's consent. Option 3 is somewhere in between. It's faster to be established compared to option 1. It can leverage the existing institution like the World Bank's legal capacity, existing structure, process, and system, and relatively cost-effective, but less flexible than option 1. Also, since it's also involves creating a new fund, so it would add to a certain degree fragmentation of the financing architecture. So now, with that, let's move to the next slide, which is my last slide. I wanted to end my presentation by sharing with you some of the key factors for consideration while establishing a financing mechanism. On the left side of the slide, I have listed some of the feedback we received during the course of INC4 and afterwards. On the right-hand side, you can see the elements I have highlighted for your attention and further discussion. So number one, there's a broad recognition that a financing mechanism is very much needed. But I think, we are not sure in what form. Is it a new dedicated fund? Is it existing fund? Or a hybrid approach? Here, I wanted to stress one point. There's a saying that form follows function, because we also need to really determine what the funds is going to support, what kind of funded activities that this fund will be financed, and also what is going to be the funding magnitude. So that would really help us to determine what form would be the most appropriate, and also the potential sources of funding, the means of mobilization. And then the second point is private sector contribution. We recognize that there is a widely accepted notion, also as Oliver and Peter stated earlier, private sector contribution, private sector engagement is critical. But then how do we really include private sector's contribution? Is it voluntary? Is it mandatory? How does that imply the governance structure of the fund? Are the things that we need to really iron out. And then next is, we also heard many stakeholders stress the importance of streamlined process, easier and faster access. So on this, we may want to consider simplified requirements of the fund and whether the fund would enable direct access. Direct access means access to the funding by national regional entities. And then last but not least, over the years, there have been a number of financial mechanisms, funds established. It's becoming quite a complex landscape. We have heard strong desires to avoid further fragmentation and proliferation. We heard also, many stakeholders want to explore broadening the contributors' base. So how we align the financial flows with the existing funds, existing institutions, and seek ways to really maximize efficiency and synergies for the fund. So let me stop here. Happy to answer any questions. Hope this is helpful to facilitate the discussion. Thank you very much. And over to you, Michael.
Excellent. That was perfect. Thank you so much. As a reminder, we will share the presentation and we will have Q&A. So please keep sharing questions. And with that, I'm going to pass this to Elizabeth Nichols, Foreign Affairs Officer, U.S. Department of State. And Liz will moderate a panel discussion with the folks you see on screen over the next 40 minutes or so. So Liz, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good morning, good evening, everyone. As Michael said, I'm Liz Nichols. I'm based at the U.S. Department of State, and I lead on finance for the U.S. within the INC process. And I'm really excited to see so many having joined us today for these important conversations. And I have the pleasure of introducing you to a truly fantastic panel. We're going to discuss issues related to financing, financing gaps, and the financial mechanism from a range of perspectives. And we will start with Iba Ismail, who is third counselor of the Embassy of the Republic of Djibouti in Nairobi and Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN Environment Program. Iba, you obviously represent Djibouti in the INC negotiations. And so from a member state perspective, I would love to hear from you what you think are the key obligations and their associated incremental costs that will need financing under this instrument, and which of these you think might be prioritized for support through the financial mechanism in emerging economies. And maybe just before I turn it over to you, I realize we have a diverse audience, happily. So just to make sure we're level set, the term incremental costs, which can be a term of art, in the context of a multilateral environmental agreement, this refers to those additional costs that a country incurs to implement provisions set by an agreement that go beyond baseline, that go beyond what would have been undertaken in the absence of that agreement. Okay, with that explanation, Hiba, over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone from wherever you're joining. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Financing Coordination Group for giving me the opportunity to take part in this important discussion ahead of the negotiations for the international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. Liz, I'd start by saying that as we're going ahead with the discussion, we need to be careful in adopting existing mechanism methodologies. And the question assumes that as of now, in my point of view, for the future treaty, as recently reported by the OECD, we saw how, even though in 2022, there was 91.6 billion US dollar of public climate finance, 69% were in the form of loans, of which the majority are non-concessional, especially those coming from MDBs, such as the World Bank, where 73% are non-concessional. For lower and upper middle income countries, the finance they have received was 85% and 87% loans, even bigger than the reported global average. Thus, in my view, the development of the new financial mechanism must be a much more equitable format. As a developing state, where I'm coming from, that reduces the incremental and we need to reduce the incremental and significant host costs that are absorbed by intermediaries between the mechanism and the recipient country. So for us, the needs of countries are different, especially for emerging economies, as you mentioned. And if we narrow the scope now, it presents a risk that whatever we deem a priority would later be a form of gatekeeping to other work or projects that a country could deem important. This is why we need proper stock taking of the needs of each country before we determine that the priorities are and the work that should be left for the COP or upcoming COP that we ambition to have through its process rather than at this stage of the establishment of the treaty. I think it's preemptive for us to start prioritizing. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, and given the amount of time we have at INC5, prioritizing in that setting might be a time challenge. Okay, well, so if that was directly focused on obligations met by the financial mechanism or supported by the financial mechanism, I want to just zoom out a tick because I can imagine that ultimately there also may be some provisions within the instrument for which financial support is needed by some countries, but may not be available through the mechanism. How should we think about prioritizing those issues, including for grant and for concessional funding with support outside the mechanism? Do you have any ideas there?
Well, again, as I said, it will be difficult for us to prioritize at this point, at this stage. And also the fact that we would also have to accommodate loan-based financing at this stage because grants will be limited or priority oriented. And that would be a view that is narrowing the ambition of the financial mechanism and actually the actual treaty, the upcoming treaty. And also a problem visible with existing mechanisms that we already see now. As of 2022, Africa accounts for only 5% of global plastic production. Yet it is one of the most affected continents or part of the planet by plastic pollution and is a net importer of plastic. For us, since we are expecting a truly ambitious plastic treaty, we want its financial mechanism to reflect the ambition and actual needs for combating plastic pollution. We know that it will have a much bigger scope than the BRS or Minamata or existing UNEP conventions treaties. So when I was reflecting on this, on existing financial mechanism, and we wanted to compare with the GCF because for us, plastic pollution is as important as climate change. So comparing to the GCF's recent numbers, as per the most recent GCF submission to the UNFCCC, November 2023 report, we still find that GCF financing for private sector projects is still 51% based on loans and only 12% grants. While for other GCF portfolio, it's an equal mix of 40% between grants and loans. This is a larger percentage for granting, largely due to a level of blended financing or other forms of co-financing that involves MDBs or bilaterals. So not all grants are true grants. That's in our point of view, as they involve co-financing that are loans. Prioritization can catalyze non-prioritized items to be pushed towards loan-based financing, and we must avoid that. So for us, in our point of view, the question would be, why should anything under the scope of this instrument not be a grant and consider other forms of financing?
That is really fascinating and helpful. And I think that you set the stage really well for the other speakers. It's not just about what are the obligations and which of them will the financial mechanism support, but the modalities of that support within and without the instrument, and thinking about prioritization. As I understand from your view, it's a little early for that, and there's some concerns that it might limit the scope of what we can ultimately do. I think that's a really helpful set of additional reflections, particularly hint for the other member states to pick up on. I think we're going to move to the next speaker in order for time. Hiba, thank you very much, and we'll come back to you during some Q&A. Okay, so next we're going to hear from Ugo Schally, who is advisor for international environmental negotiations in the Directorate General for the Environment at the European Commission. Ugo, as another key negotiator in the INC process, I wanted to pose similar questions to those that Hiba just took on, starting with what you would see as the key obligations and their associated incremental costs that we need to agree and to finance under the instrument, and how you think about prioritization for support with respect to the financial mechanism. And first, you'll need to unmute.
After all these years, I still forget about those things. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and good time of the day to all of you. It's a pleasure to participate. I think we're discussing here one of the key issues under negotiation, and I think that from our perspective, where we're coming from, there is a real issue before launching into the discussion on what type of costs could be covered by what type of mechanism, since sources and means are not an end in themselves, but a way to reach a desirable outcome. And I think I would actually add a tiny little thing to your explanation on incremental cost, which is the link to global environmental benefits, which is always the case in that regard. And that makes it clear that it comes from a very specific background, in the sense that in multilateral environmental agreements, when we discuss those, it's linked to actually undertaking action to phase out, to diminish, to reduce, whereas the Plastics Treaty has a much broader scope, as Hiba has actually just said, and would actually cover a good part of productive sectors in many countries in that regard. And I think that from that perspective, we actually need to look at the broader finance landscape. And it's very clear that the traditional discussion about the role of ODA in that regard, and that's where, we started off many years ago with the multilateral fund, that the Montreal Protocol no longer applies. And I think that in the recent years, we were talking very much about mobilization of resources from all sources, in particular, since for this treaty to work, we actually need to sort of make changes to hold the whole value chain. In that sense, productive investments through loans, the involvement of public and private investment in that regard is crucial. And I think there is a separate element that I think is quite crucial in that regard, is that the paying the fair share from all those who are involved in the value chain. And by saying that, I, of course, refer to the polluter pays principle that need to be explicitly taken into account in that regard, in terms of where the money would be coming from, public and private, and where it would actually go to, most notably to those countries most in need for specific investments in that regard, and that cannot do those investments themselves. And I think that, as has been said, there is the world is essentially divided into three groups. It's the jurisdictions that are primarily polymer producers, jurisdictions that are producers and users, and a large number of jurisdictions that are primarily consumers of plastic and plastic products. And that's certainly what we would need to take into account. And different obligations under the treaty would actually affect different parties in a different way. And the parties would have very different capacities to actually deal with those, and have very different and sometimes very vibrant and dynamic economic sectors can actually take care of that. And also taking into account that some of those changes would actually bring a lot of economic advantages and opportunities. I think when we look at what activities would be financed by external assistance, which I think is the question, I think we have a long way to go to understand how that could actually work together. Thank you.
So you and Eva have some alignment that it's a little early days somehow to answer some of these questions, and that even posing the question about matching obligations to financing is general in its primary form. You've introduced into the conversation ideas about a framework through which to see the world that's with respect to perhaps the degree to which an economy is based on plastics and plastic production and what kind, which I think is a really helpful additional lens. Quickly, I was hoping you could then talk a little bit about, given the need for nuance in this, do you think you could still offer some views about the kinds of financing gaps that you a priori anticipate, and any ideas about how we would tackle them outside of the financial mechanism?
I think what is really key, and I think we've seen examples of that, is to look at what are actually the whole financing streams that are happening. As in all, I think, environmental matters, financing for such matters that come through multilateral channels is a small minority of the finance. The vast majority is domestic. The vast majority of the international is private. And then you actually have, you look at what is actually the role of public financing in that regard. And I think that you have, and I think that's what I already said in my previous comments, you would have the actions that would actually be productive and transformative investment in the productive sector that changes the way plastic is designed and produced, with the sort of consequential economic opportunities. And on the other hand, to look at what is necessary to provide for a effective and efficient management of such products at the end of their life cycle, in view of bringing the maximum amount of the material incorporated in products back into the production chain. So I think there's a lot of possibility for productive investment that could actually leveraged by or incentivized by bringing private investment in. And I think it's really difficult to see what would be the residual part for international public finance in that regard. What is actually the additional value in that regard? Thank you.
That is incredibly helpful. Thank you, Ugo. We're going to move now from member states sort of back into the real world, and hear from Khatija Khan, who is head of social impact solutions at the Societe Generale Group. Khadija, I mean, I think the top line message that you're hearing is that public assistance alone will not be enough to tackle this. I think that's a starting point that we all share. So given that, what general role do you see private capital playing in this effort?
Thanks, Elizabeth, for the question, and hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. So I suppose in order to answer this question, I'd invite you to take a step back and really look at the problem that we are trying to resolve here. If we talk about plastic waste, and especially plastic waste entering into the global oceans, there's 8 million tons entering into the oceans annually. And the majority of this leakage is occurring out of Southeast Asia and Africa thereafter. And the reason why this is happening is essentially because the local infrastructure is underdeveloped and in some cases even missing, right? And private investors, so especially those looking for commercial returns, they often shy away from the emerging markets, and especially within this particular sector, because I would say that it's fair to say that 90% of the plastic waste management sector in these countries is dependent on the informal sector. So you essentially have NGOs and social businesses really doing all the work on plastic waste management. And investors see this as a very high operational and credit risk, as well as the country risk appears quite high in most cases. So all of this to say that, in my view, commercial investors on their own will not potentially be able to do this single-handedly. And what we really need to be looking at is instruments that are guided by the notion of blended finance. And in particular, one category that we have really been working on is outcomes-based finance, where you have both commercial investors and impact investors or even philanthropic investors joining hands together, working together to resolve some of these issues. And the main notion on how these sorts of funding mechanisms work is that these investors pool their funding together, and they put them in social impact projects or environmental impact projects. And rather than being reimbursed based on the financial performance of these initiatives, what happens is that they are reimbursed based on the impact of the project. So the higher the environmental impact, the higher the social impact, the higher the opportunity for them to get reimbursed and also earn a potentially decent ROI on their initiatives. So that's something we can talk about as well in a bit, but definitely that's where we see a lot of scope on attracting commercial investors into the market by working alongside other impact and philanthropically motivated investors.
Thank you very much. And there's a lot to do to incentivize those actions that happens, let's say, outside of the narrow scope of the instrument. I think it'd be remiss to not ask you. The Société Générale Group has this really robust track record of financing all these diverse organizations that tackle plastic pollution and doing so in really innovative ways. Could you give us a couple of bullet points about the group's approaches, things we could think about applying as we move forward?
Yes, sure. So in I would say under the more of the mainstream or sustainable finance initiatives, obviously we have the bank supporting recycling initiatives, plastic recycling plants. For example, recently in Cameroon, SG Cameroon supported a plastic recycling plant under concessional terms within their sustainable finance department. But on the more, I would say, innovative, the more innovative approaches that we've been building, especially our team, I'd like to come back to the OBF, outcomes-based finance approach. So just recently, we structured a transaction for the Unilever Group, wherein we were able to bring forth private sector funding from an impact investor into plastic waste management projects across Africa, especially there were some in Nigeria. And the way we went about it was we incentivized the impact investor to achieve certain KPIs on plastic waste. For example, the tons of plastics collected and recycled, and especially focusing on the more, I would say, difficult plastics that most of these economies are dealing with. For example, flexible plastics. And what was innovative about the approach was that we did not make the social business in question have any liability on their balance sheet. It was treated as a grant for them. And we were able to bring in the private sector, so essentially Unilever in this case, as what we call the outcome funder. So Unilever would be the one reimbursing the investor as and when the impact has been achieved, even though the funding is being received directly by the social business and NGOs on the ground carrying out the project. So that's really one recent example of how we are trying to engage the private sector, both on the investment side and on the grant side, because in effect, this turns into a grant from Unilever's perspective once they reimburse the investor at the end of the lifetime of the project. And just going ahead, we will be further developing this approach and implementing it at a much larger scale. We are working with some development agencies within Europe, and also we are supporting initiatives with such as the United Nations, the UNEP group on plastics, to really implement this approach at a much larger scale.
Thank you so much. Concrete examples, also examples of how key partnerships are in doing and scaling. And a wonderful segue over to Leah Pedersen, who is the Senior Director of Market Acceleration and Design Innovation at Convergence. And so, Leah, I mean, blended finance is obviously a term that we hear in the mix of parts of the solution to fill these financing gaps. And we heard a lot about blended finance just now from Khadija. Could you give us a one-sentence definition of what blended finance is for the benefit of our mixed audience? And then would love to get your thoughts on how we leverage this to tackle plastic pollution.
Sure, no, happy to. And thank you so much for having Convergence here today. This is such an important topic. So with respect to blended finance, for those in the audience who the term might be new, is the whole goal is it's a structuring approach in which organizations may come together applying public sector capital alongside philanthropic capital to basically de-risk or make it easier for private capital to enter markets or address sectors they wouldn't otherwise address. And so at the end of the day, it's an impact-oriented structuring approach. So with respect to plastics, plastics are largely seen as an SDG-focused area that goes undercapitalized. And so for those who are familiar with the history of blended finance, I'll step back a bit to say that Convergence itself was launched in 2017 at the Addis Ababa Innovative Finance Summit. And it was that time when global stakeholders came together to address the broader issue of how to finance for the SDGs, recognizing there would be severe undercapitalization, and blended finance was an approach to do so. Now, from 2017 until where we are today, Convergence and other organizations have worked to build ecosystems and transaction pipeline, et cetera. But we're still faced with these severely undercapitalized SDGs. Those that are quite a bit, I would say, more frequently capitalized using blended finance tend to be renewable energy or agriculture or financial services, where frankly, there's more of what you would call a deal pipeline or perhaps business models. An investor actually knows where they're putting their money. There's a track record. Perhaps the deal size is much larger. In this case, we're seeing a funding gap, at least in terms of private investment, of it's quite sizable, obviously, and a lot of numbers have been thrown out there, but over hundreds of billions of dollars. From 2018, I think, to 2023, over the course of 5 years, there was approximately $160 billion of private investment invested in plastics circularity. That's about $30 billion, more or less, per year. It's obviously undercapitalized and in need of additional resources to meet the objectives at hand.
Absolutely. Could you briefly then describe some of the design funding initiatives that Convergence offers and maybe talk a little bit about how these can be used by businesses that are trying to tackle plastic pollution?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually going to use a bit of an example that's related to climate and the broader discussion, and that's investing in natural capital, investing in nature-based solutions. I'm bringing the audience attention to that nomenclature in particular because it's now mainstream. 3-4 years ago, investing in that space was not mainstream. And so the reason I raise it is you brought up design funding and our market acceleration work within Convergence. And so what is design funding and how did it help build NBS? Design funding is essentially investing in these very early stage blended finance solutions. So blended finance could look like an NGO coming alongside a financial institution saying, how do we solve for problem X? How do we solve for uneducated or undereducated women and girls and or providing access to clean water? In this case, it's plastic circularity. It's increased access to reduced waste, so reduced land degradation, etc. So we're solving for a particular problem. The NGO and the financial institution may come together, but in their design process, they frankly don't have enough capital or resources to actually launch a vehicle. And that's where design funding is actually quite critical. We come alongside those NGOs to use blended finance in a way that it can solve those specific social issues.
That is fantastic. And again, it just underscores the point that there's so much that needs to happen with groups that have technical expertise and roots and ground understanding in the field, and develop the kinds of partnerships over time within and without governments to make these things really happen. Sometimes, as a negotiator, you get so focused on what is within your control within the treaty text, but there's a tremendous world beyond that we really need to leverage to be able to finance the outcomes that we all want. So thank you very much. And now we're going to go back to the member state side of the House and talk to Rolfi Al-Hanif, who is Assistant Deputy for Waste Management at the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime Affairs and Investment in the Government of Indonesia. Rolfi, thank you so much for being with us today. Well, I would briefly, given time, love your take on some of the same questions that we've asked of Hiba and Ugo. So from a member state perspective, do you have a view on what are the key obligations or incremental costs to agree on and finance under the instrument? And if there is any kind of prioritization for support that you could speak to with respect to the financial mechanism? Thanks.
Thank you, Elise. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts and experience so far in this important forum. So I hope that from this discussion and forum will provide a constructive input to the discussion under the INC later on. So as we understand that the discussion on this new legally binding is now focusing on several detailed aspects, particularly on funding and obligation and consequences to participating countries like Indonesia as part of developing countries. I personally believe that the implementation of this international legally binding will only success if there's some support from for the developing countries in managing plastic waste throughout the entire plastic value chains from the upstream to the downstream. So let's before I ask you a question, let's look to Indonesia at this moment. So as an archipelagic and big country with more than 280 population and a growing economy, the issue of plastic products and usage and post-consumption plastic waste management is becoming increasingly challenging. On the other hand, that the government capacity to manage household waste, where plastic waste proportion is increasing every year, so it's become challenging, and the capacity of development is very limited. So one of the challenges focus is high dependence on plastic product and especially plastic packaging and single-use plastic bags. So back to your question. So I believe that the key obligation that needed financing under this instrument or ILBI will include the several aspects such as the regulatory and policy development. So we need to have a better formulation and enforcement of policies in the countries on plastic to reduce plastic production and consumption, including bans on certain type of plastic product. Actually, Indonesia has initiated on this issue, but has not been effective due to lack of enforcement and the absence of the cheap alternative plastic material. So this is also really challenging. So some policies work, I mean, the limitation of plastic bag, for example, it works in big malls, but it's less effective in a certain traditional market, for example, which is still a big numbers. So secondly, we need also to focus on the waste management infrastructures. So we need to support countries in the development of enhancement of recycling facilities, waste collection system, and waste management in general, including the usage of technology, high technology. And also we need a public awareness and education campaign. It is also important to start also working with the community, with the people to change their behavior, to be more responsible for the plastics, start from their house, for example. And we need also research and development. We need innovative, let's say, we need some innovative in biodegradable plastic material, for example, plastic alternative and improved recycling technologies. We at the developing countries really need support to strengthen this issue. And we need also like to establish monitoring and reporting systems. We need to really track to establish a robust methodology to track the plastics from the production, consumption, and until to waste management. So I think with this information technology, we can do this in more comprehensive, and it will like help decision makers at national and also regional and local level. And we need also to be more realistic with the plastic that has been in the environment. We need to do more plastic cleanup because plastic is already in the nature, in the land, also in the ocean and rivers. We need also to focus our support on this issue. So in addition to that, for the developing countries, I think the important financial support should be focused on strengthening the efforts such as I mentioned, basic waste management infrastructure and capacity building for the local community, local government, and also some stakeholders. We need also to support like community-based program. You know, there are so many initiatives at the grassroots level that they need to be enhance their capacity. Let's say in Indonesia, yes, we have a lot of West Bank, for example, as a frontliner in collection of plastic and other unorganic waste. So if we can work with them, so we can also amplify the impact of these community-based programs. And access to technology, I think, as I mentioned, we need also technology in collection, recycling, and other waste management in general. So we need also to incentivize the economics that has been starting in the community or in the local government. So we need a program that provide economic incentive for reducing plastic use and promoting recycling, such as subsidize of grants for businesses and communities. So yeah, take me also take some example. There are so many like startup companies, small one, but they they are now flourishing in Indonesia. We need to give to support them to be more effective, efficient, and cover more areas in the country. So I think that some focus on the financing that we need to support.
Rafi, that was fantastic and detailed, and some of the major elements I wanted to lift up out of that are financing the innovation that we need. So many countries are producing so much good work and just need an extra push and support in that regard. Financing local communities to organize and incentivize and support scaling of the small businesses that are doing the right thing but may need the commercial loans, et cetera, to get to the next level. I think these are important things to lift up because sometimes when you look at obligations in the treaty text itself, it's a little hard to map sometimes on the real world. I think you just provided a really profound link between the two. So thank you very much. And I recognize that we are headed to our last speaker, and we're not going to give him a lot of time. But Rolf Payet, last but never least, Executive Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, BRS, known and really appreciated by many of us. Rolf, thanks for being with us here today. Just, I guess, one mega question for you. So based on your experience with BRS and specifically with the Stockholm Convention, which has a financial mechanism, which is the Global Environment Facility, could you talk about some of the obligations / agreed incremental costs that are supported by the GEF, and what are some of the obligations under Stockholm which are dependent instead on outside financial support? And if there are any patterns or lessons learned from that experience that you would like to make known to apply to plastics. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to this panel discussion. And of course, as you've rightly said, the Basel and Rotterdam conventions don't have a financial mechanism. So the question you can ask, which I hope I can answer in a very quick manner, is how do we operate and implement those two important conventions, knowing very well that the Basel Convention also deals with plastics, right? But first, let's look at the Stockholm Convention. And Stockholm Convention is serviced by the Global Environment Facility. And one of the important support that the GEF provides is in the preparation of the national implementation plans, where parties to the Stockholm Convention define what are their priorities and how they wish, and also which chemicals that they have been listed on the Stockholm Convention, and which of these chemicals are needed to be managed, what are the needs and what are the requirements. But of course, often is the jump between the national implementation plan to the actual implementation. And there are different levels of implementation success, and of course there's a review process and an effectiveness process under the Stockholm Convention, which actually reviews every so many years the effectiveness of the implementation of the convention. One caveat I have to mention here is that the Stockholm Convention eventually aims to control, restrict, and eventually eliminate completely those chemicals listed under the Stockholm Convention. So it's a bit different from what we're discussing in the wider discussion on plastics. And there, obviously, a large amount of funds are usually set aside, for example, for the destruction of PCBs, which really is to pay companies to actually burn the thing in a proper technological facility, which has the technology to burn and to break down those chemicals into different components that are not impactful on the environment and so on. So it's a bit of a different here. We're not really turning plastics into other products. We're not really recycling them because those chemicals in the Stockholm are deemed to be toxic and accumulative in the human body. That said, obviously, there are a number of additives that are added to plastics. And of course, there's a big discussion of chemicals of concerns in plastics. And that touches, obviously, on the role that the Stockholm Convention will play in that process. Just to give you, and not to make it hopefully not more complicated than it is. Now, when it comes to the work of Basel, it's been really challenging because Basel really deals with transboundary movement of waste. And here we're not just dealing with plastic waste, but a whole gamut of electronic waste, waste listed textiles waste, tires, everything that becomes waste eventually, becomes considered within the scope of the Basel Convention. So without structured funding, it is very, very difficult to see how we can support countries. And probably this points to the root cause of the problems we have today, because the conventions and the other instruments have put in place have not really provided basic financing for strengthening waste management, because at the end of the day, one of the biggest challenges of plastics in the oceans, plastics in the atmosphere, and so on, is because of poor waste management. And since we've not been investing in waste management, we're ending up with the global situation today, for which now we are negotiating an international treaty specifically on plastic waste. But let's think of electronic waste, for example. How much investment is going into this? And so this calls for a critical, not only rethinking on the financial mechanism for the plastics treaty, but also for the Basel Convention and other treaties that are not really being supported in addressing this global issue. So the other point, and I know time is limited, there has been efforts by the parties to the three conventions, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, together with the United Nations Environment Programme, to bring together a financial facility, which has been called now the special program, for which several donors have made important contributions to, where it supports institutional strengthening. Because one of the basic challenges that we have, not only in waste management, also in chemicals and products management, is the institutional structure in place, the legal structure, the policy structure, but also the enforcement, the customs officers that, as you know, plastics, whether in virgin form or in the products or in the waste form, go through customs, and of course they need to be trained. We need to have robust institutions in order to ensure that such a system will work. We also need to collect data. We need to be accountable in terms of what's going through different between countries, and also what's ending up in the oceans. Otherwise, we will have a financial mechanism. Yes, we'll have a treaty, but we will know how effective this treaty and whether we also putting our money where the problem is. So strengthening governance and institutions is actually central to addressing not only the work under the new treaty, but also the implementation of the three conventions, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention. Now, I just wanted to make a brief mention about voluntary funding, because many of these funding mechanisms are voluntary. As you know, the treaties themselves are based upon assessed contributions, which is a contribution made by all parties to that convention based upon, it's a figure which is calculated by the UN, depending on the size of the economy and the GDP and so on. So this is the core funding, which is really allocated for the running of the Secretariat, for us to be able to actually do the work, to pay staff salaries and so on. But when it comes to implementing activities on the ground, a lot of these funding or even funding mechanisms that I mentioned before are dependent upon voluntary funding. That is contributions from various countries, and this can go up and down. So how do you plan long-term investment in those areas, whether it is from states or blended financing or from the private sector? How do we ensure there is long-term sustainability and reliability in the implementation of such a financial mechanism? Because as you know, there are some financial mechanisms which have not been replenished in so many years, and some are replenished 1 year and the other year. Elizabeth, I know you want to come in. As you can see, there's a lot more to share in terms of experiences, but I will stop here. Thank you very much.
I'm so sorry that we have to cut you off for time, because that was incredibly helpful. And it's the punchline perhaps is so much about finance has to do with things that are not directly about finance: governance, incentives, instruments, policies, other multilateral agreements. I want to thank everyone on our panel so much for their time today. Michael, do you want to handle asking the one question we probably...
Yeah, and we're out of time. I really want to be mindful and respectful, but maybe one or two folks very, very quickly, like literally 10 seconds, 15 seconds, like what precedents for success or failure have you seen with setup of other multilateral funds? So any quick reactions to that?
Overly complicated and not accessible. So take what's out there and make the most of it.
If I may, falling back on the old idea of being elemented by public funding and working in the way of replenishments. I think that's not the thing that would work for the plastic treaty. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent. Great. I know a number of questions have been answered in the chat, and we'll try to answer others when we send out a recap. But I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists and Liz for moderating such a great panel and all the participants who joined. So thank you so much. As a reminder, we will send out a summary of this and a recording, and we will let you know about the next webinar. Again, we'll do 2 before INC in November. So we really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining. Great evening and day.
Thank you. Take care.